everyone, I'm Whitney and today I'm sharing the final video in my sampler sew along series, and I'm going to be showing you how to take your 12 quilt blocks and turn them into a beautiful fully finished quilt. So throughout this series so far, I have shared step-by-step tutorials for 12 different historical quilt blocks, and if you happen to miss any of those, or if you're completely new to this series, you can find the playlist with all the tutorials in it linked down below in the video description box or in the information icon in the upper corner of the screen. So when I planned my sampler quilt from the start, before I even made any of the videos in the series, I knew a pretty good idea of how I wanted my finished quilt to look. I felt this was important since obviously I was the one making the series. And so some things I wanted to include were sashing, cornerstones, and borders on my quilt top in addition to the quilt blocks themselves. Now I might have just used some quilting words that you have no idea what they mean, and that's okay. So I want to start off by explaining what some of those terms mean so that you're not completely confused throughout the rest of this video. So first up is sashing. Sashing is a strip of fabric that goes between the quilt blocks themselves to give a visual break between the blocks. This can be done in quilts where all the blocks are the same design, or especially in sampler quilts like the one I'm showing in this video, where each block is a different quilt block from all the other ones, which is what makes it a sampler quilt. It's where you're trying out all different types of quilt blocks. So the sashing is the strips of fabric that separate the quilt blocks from each other. Now the cornerstones are a contrasting piece of fabric that actually breaks up the sashing, and it goes where it meets at the corners of the quilt blocks themselves. So a cornerstone is the same width as the sashing. It is just the location of it that makes it different, and the fact that it is done in a contrasting fabric so that it stands out and just gives a little more visual interest to the quilt. And cornerstones definitely take more time to add in, but if you're willing to take that additional time, it definitely adds something visually that you just wouldn't get otherwise. And then finally, borders. Borders go all the way around the outside of your quilt top. So after all the blocks are sewn together, either with or without sashing, the borders then go all the way around the outer edge. And you can have one border, you can have two borders, four borders in all different widths and fabrics. It is totally up to you and what you're looking for in your finished quilt top. So let's back up just a little bit now. I know I have already shown you my finished quilt, but it can probably be a little daunting to go from your stack of quilt blocks all the way to seeing a finished quilt and not really knowing how to get from the blocks to the finished quilt. Where to start that process and what exactly needs to be done. And I wanted to quickly point out that your quilt does not have to look just like mine. You do not have to add all the extra things. That definitely takes time. It takes more attention to detail. It takes more measurements. You definitely don't have to do all that. You can add in as much or as little as you want depending on the time you want to invest, the skill that you have, and just the overall look that you are going for. But no matter how you want to finish your quilt, the very first thing I recommend is laying all of your quilt blocks out. So find a spot on a table, a bed, the floor, just a spot that is large enough and clean. If you're not certain that your surface is clean enough, you can lay down a bed sheet or something like that and lay your blocks out on top just to get an idea of the layout that you want them to be in. So you can play around with the placement, going off of color. Maybe you want to group a lot of colors together, or maybe you want to make sure a certain color is spread out evenly throughout your quilt. That is totally up to you and how many colors you used in your quilt and just the look that you want. But just lay them all out, and I definitely recommend taking some pictures while you're doing this. So get your cell phone or camera, whatever you have, and just hold it up above your quilt blocks. You may have to stand on a chair for this, just be careful, and snap a picture looking straight down at your blocks laid out. That way you can get a good idea of what it will look like in its finished form. and then walk away and take a look at those photos. Don't just look at your actual blocks. Take a look at your photo, because your photo might show things that you wouldn't notice in real, like in actual life. You could see, is it missing contrast on one side of your quilt? Or are some of your blocks actually oriented the wrong way and maybe they need to be rotated around? Or just different things that may not appeal to you in the way they are currently laid out. And if you notice something you don't like, then come back and rearrange them, shift them around. Do whatever you think might help, and then snap some more pictures and look at them again. And just do that as long as it takes to get the layout that you like. And then obviously snap one final picture of that final layout and erase those other pictures so you don't get confused about which layout you ended up liking the most. So as I was laying out my quilt blocks, I was trying to make sure that I didn't have all of a lot of one color on one side, and that they were kind of evenly spread throughout. So all my reds weren't in one area and all my blues in one area. They were kind of intermixed in a fairly balanced way. I also paid attention to where a few of my most favorite blocks were, because I knew I wanted to hang my finished quilt on my quilt ladder that I have, and I wanted to be able to fold it in a certain way that a few of my favorite blocks were really shown off, and so I definitely took that into account in the placement while I was laying out all my blocks. If you sew the blocks together that I have shown you how to make, and you just sew them together with no sashing, no borders, or anything like that, you will get a quilt that finishes 36 by 48 inches. And that is a good size quilt for like a small baby quilt. So after you have a layout that you are pretty sure that you like, start thinking about those other elements. So do you want your quilt to be larger, and do you want to do that by using sashing between your blocks and actually separating them by that strip of fabric? Or would you rather sew them all side by side and then add borders around the outside and use your borders to gain your extra size? This is something that's important to decide ahead of time. Or do you want both? I definitely went for both to gain that extra width and length, and just to separate my blocks a little bit. I wanted to have that little visual gap between all the blocks so they each stood out on their own, but still looked good together in the quilt. So my mom was actually here while I was laying out all these blocks, and she was helping me decide on a good layout and different things, and that was so helpful to have someone else to kind of bounce ideas off of, in addition to snapping the pictures and looking at them to see how I felt. She could kind of give me some extra ideas and just ideas for what I could do. We also started taking some measurements. So we laid all the blocks out, and we left little gaps in between for what we thought would be a good sashing size, and then we would like measure that gap and kind of take it into account of how much that measurement is in proportion to the size of the blocks, and just kind of running some numbers and in our heads to just get a feel for how this quilt could turn out. And I actually have a post on my website with all of the finalized measurements for the sashing, the cornerstones, the borders, everything that we figured out that day, all our notes. I'm going to have all of those listed out on my website, so you can look at it if you want to finish your quilt pretty similarly to mine, or if you just want to get an idea of the measurements that we used for reference. Definitely go check out that post on my website. The link will be down below in the video description box. So after we kind of had a rough idea on all of the elements we wanted to include, we had to start picking out the fabrics. And I think this was actually the hardest part. I wanted to incorporate some of the fabrics over again to make sure the whole quilt top was cohesive. And I thought I was going to use one fabric for all of the cornerstones. But we tried all the fabrics, and none of them seemed to look good in every spot where a cornerstone was going to be. So my mom suggested that I actually use a different fabric for each cornerstone. And at first I really wasn't sure about it, but we started laying the fabrics out between the blocks, and that is what we settled on. So you can see this one's purple, This one is yellow. Then we have the teal, red, orange, and the other teal. There's actually 2 teals in this quilt. So that is what we ended up finally deciding, was that the way to make all the colors come together was to actually include all the colors again. And that worked out for my quilt, but for yours it may be some other solution. So again, a lot of this is just kind of playing around with it and figuring out what is going to work for you and what suits your tastes and your style. And in addition to that, I had only planned on there being 1 border on this quilt. I had planned on a thick white border. I just thought that would look nice, and I knew I had plenty of fabric to do that, so I just thought I would do the sashing, the cornerstones, and 1 white border, and my quilt top would be done. But thanks to my mom's suggestion, I planned it to have a second border, and this is actually my favorite part of the quilt. I am so glad my mom suggested this, because she felt that the white border right next to the blocks that have a lot of white in them, it would just kind of all smush together, and it just would be like blocks floating in a sea of white. And I am so glad she suggested this little skinny border here, because I think it just sets off the quilt so beautifully, and it looks like it has a nice frame around the quilt. Absolutely beautiful. Thank you, Mom, for that suggestion. So after my mom suggested the skinny multicolored border, and we knew we wanted to do the binding in that fabric as well, we had to do some measuring, because I only had like 1 piece of the fabric left that was like not very big by the width of the fabric, and then 1 extra little chunk left from when I was working on one of the blocks. So we did the measurements, and we figured out how wide we would need to cut all the pieces, and did the math on how many strips we would need, because we knew we could get about like 41 inches from the width of the fabric. And so we measured around like how big the quilt will be at that point, knew how many inches we would need to go around and all of that, and measured to make sure we would have enough fabric. This piece right here is all of this fabric that is left from this entire quilt. So thankfully we measured accurately, and there was no bad cuts. So like very careful cutting, and it all fit, and it looks absolutely beautiful, and I'm so happy. So throughout the entire time that you are planning out your quilt layout, make sure you are making notes. Even if you change your mind on something later, make notes along the way. And when you're figuring out all your measurements, remember that your pieces need to be cut a ½ inch larger than you want them to be finished. For example, get out my tape measure. This multicolor strip right here, the border, it finishes 1 inch. So this piece of fabric had to be cut 1.5 inches wide, because when you sew it to the block on this side, that takes up 1/4 inch in the seam allowance. And when you sew it to the border on this side, that takes up 1/4 inch seam allowance. So your 1.5 inch piece is now only 1 inch wide. So make sure to keep that in mind when you're doing all this planning, especially if you are not certain if you have enough fabric or if it's going to be pretty close. Plus, you just want your stuff to turn out the size that you are picturing it. So don't forget to include those seam allowances. They are very, very important to get the finished quilt size that you're wanting and to get the proportions that you're wanting. So once you have all your blocks and any additional pieces like sashing and borders and all that sewn together, you have a completed quilt top. So this is not a fully finished quilt, it is the quilt top. To make it a fully finished quilt, you need to add a backing and batting fabric in between. So there are lots and lots of types of batting out there. I am by no means an expert on them. You will need to do your own research and find what kind of batting you like the most. This might depend on what weight you like your quilts to be, or what climate you live on, or if your quilt, or live in, sorry, what climate you live in. if you are going to be using your quilt or if you're going to be displaying your quilt. All of that can be taken into account on what kind of batting you want to use. I do suggest though, if your quilt has as much white fabric in it as mine does, you want to make sure that you use a white batting. Because if you use a more like natural color batting that has that kind of off-white color to it, it may show through your white fabric and not look as nice. So do take that into account. And then for your backing fabric, this can be one really, really big piece of fabric. They do sell fabric that is like 108 inches wide. So if you want to go that route, you definitely can. Just make sure to buy enough that it will be larger than your quilt top by several inches on each side. And or if you don't want to go that route, you can piece together fabric for your backing. I definitely go this route most of the time. And in fact, on this quilt right here, the backing is pieced with two different fabrics. You can piece together the same fabric to get it to a large enough square or rectangle or whatever size, or you can piece together multiple fabrics. So for this one in particular, there is the white tone-on-tone fabric I used for my quilt blocks, and then there is a white tone-on-tone polka dot fabric that is not in the front of the quilt, but it's just what was on hand when the backing was being done. They're all white. Really, you can't tell unless you're super up close, and it's fine. It doesn't matter. In the past, I have pieced together quilt backs from the same fabric. I just cut it and sewed it on the other side. I have also pieced together where I used leftover fabrics from the front of the quilt in the back. I did this on one of my rainbow quilts actually, and I really, really like how it turns out. Where it just kind of brings in some of the fun from the front side of the quilt into the back for just an extra little like surprise on the back. After you have all of your batting and backing and all that figured out, then you make your quilt sandwich. So this is where you put your backing fabric good side facing down, then your batting, and your quilt top good side facing up. You baste all those layers together. There's basting spray or basting pens. You can baste with like large running stitches, your choice. And then you need to quilt your actual quilt. So quilting can be done in a few different ways. You can hand quilt. I've done that on smaller quilts before. You can quilt it on a home sewing machine, or you can have a long armor quilted on a long arm quilting machine. My mom has had a quilt quilted by a long armor. She has had quilts that she's quilted on home sewing machines. I've quilted quilts on home sewing machines. It just depends on what you want to do. If you want to finish your quilt yourself, or if you want to have someone help you, that is all up to you. This quilt in particular was done on a home sewing machine using a stitch in the ditch method. This is where you sew your quilting lines following the lines that are already done in the patchwork. So on this one, you can see on the back here that the quilting lines right here and right here, these mimic the lines that were already on the quilt top. So this is the skinny border, and that's where the quilting was sewn. So on the front, you can't really see the quilting that much because it is sewn right along the line where the fabric's already joined together. And it's not densely quilted. There are some quilts that practically every quarter inch of the quilt is sewn on, and that's fine. A-okay if that's your style. Since this is going to be more of a display quilt, it wasn't super important to me to have it super densely quilted because it's going to be hanging up looking pretty and not needing to be washed over and over and over, where it really needs that quilting to hold it all together nicely in the wash. So once your quilt is quilted, it is time to add the binding. And I have a whole separate video tutorial showing exactly how to sew binding on a quilt, and I will link to that video in the description box down below. There are two different binding types that you can use. You can use bias binding where it is cut on the bias or the 45-degree angle of the fabric. But on quilts, bias binding isn't really necessary because you're not having to go around any curves or anything where the fabric would need to be flexible to fit around the shape. There is just straight lines on a quilt, on the outer edge of a quilt. So you can use just strips of fabric that are cut selvage to selvage, and that's what was done on this one, especially since we were so limited on the fabric. There was no sense in doing bias binding. So once you have done all the steps, you can step back and look at your fully completed, beautiful quilt and be so proud of yourself because you did something amazing. You took just stacks of fabric and you turned them into something beautiful and functional and wonderful, and I am proud of you. And you may look at it and say, well, it's not perfect. It has these mess ups and these things where I didn't do it right. That's okay. Nobody is perfect. Nobody's quilt is going to be perfect. Nobody's anything is going to be perfect. There is actually a piece in this quilt square right here. It is this white piece right here. It is backwards. The wrong side is facing up, and I noticed it after I had finished the quilt block and taken the pictures and everything, and I would have had to take off like 4 pieces of fabric to fix it, and I said, I don't care. It measures exactly 12.5 inches like it's supposed to. I don't care. I'm leaving it. I'm not fixing it. It will just have to stay that way. And I also use black thread on that quilt square, and it shows a little bit, and it's fine. My quilt is not perfect, and that's fine because I am still very proud of myself, and I'm very proud of you. And I'm also very proud of my mom because, let's be honest, my mom did all the finishing work on this quilt. Yep. So I mentioned that my mom was here when I was figuring out the layout of my quilt and all of that, and actually I sent all of my quilt blocks home with my mom, and she finished my quilt for me because my mom is wonderful and she's better at quilting than I am. So after I had finished the 12th quilt block in the series, I knew it would take me forever to finish this quilt because I don't know when I would find time to do it, and also I knew that I would probably not be very happy with it if I finished it myself. I've never done cornerstones before. I just am not in a quilting mood right now, and my mom has finished a lot more quilts than I have. So I called my mom and I said, hey mom, can I hire you to finish my quilt because I need it to be completed. I need it done like sometime this year. And could you help me with it? Because I don't feel like quilting right now. And she was so wonderful, and she said she would do it. And I think she did amazing. So I made the quilt blocks themselves, the ones that you saw the tutorials for, and I decided on the final layout of the blocks, and with my mom's help, we decided on all of the measurements for the sashing and all of that stuff. And then I sent the blocks and material home with my mom, and she finished all the rest of it for me. She snapped pictures and sent me along the way, and called me and asked me a couple of questions, got some more input from me on the finishing and all of that, and she did the work for me, and I think she did absolutely amazing, and I'm so grateful. I would love if you would leave a comment below this video telling my mom thank you for helping me finish this quilt so that I could enjoy my finished quilt and so that I could show you all how to finish your quilt, because I don't think it would have happened without my mom's help on this project. I got overwhelmed and I needed her to help me, and she was so gracious and she helped me. So I would love if you would leave a comment telling my mom thank you for the help and letting her know what a wonderful job she did on it. Also, while you're down there, don't forget to check out those links that are in the video description box. The one for the website post, the blog post, with all of the measurements and details, as well as the other videos that I referenced throughout this video. So I think that's everything I have to share for today. If you had any questions for anything that I didn't cover in this video, leave them down below, and until next time, happy sewing!